Okay, everybody. This is going to be the first of a series of recorded lectures on St. Thomas Aquinas' views about justice. What we're actually going to start with is not the section of the reading under the title of justice. We're actually going to start with the section of the reading that's under the title of law, because law is very central. Well, it's central to justice on anyone's conception, but it's very central to justice on Aquinas' conception. Because Aquinas is what's called a natural law theorist. And we're going to encounter the term natural law a bunch of times in this course. And the purpose, in part, of starting with Aquinas is that Aquinas is where all the later authors are going to sort of get their idea of what natural law is. He's the most prominent natural law theorist ever. He didn't come up with it. He didn't invent it. You'll be able to see that from a few comments he makes where he's talking about what previous authors have had to say about the nature of law. But he is by far the most prominent expositor of natural law theory, definitely in the Catholic tradition. But because of the influence of the Catholic tradition, given the fact that natural law theory comes out of the Catholic tradition, his influence touches even non-Catholics. So the first thing to get clear on when it comes to the natural law, now we'll get into a description of it more later, but if you're talking about natural law, one perfectly legitimate way to use that expression is to talk about like the laws of physics or the laws of chemistry, or laws of biology, or things like that, where those are descriptive laws. They're laws describing how things behave. And as a result, they allow you to predict how things will behave in the future. So you have a law of gravitation that will allow you to predict how quickly things will fall in a given environment. Now, that is, like I said, perfectly legitimate use of the word or the expression natural law, but it's not the sense we have in mind in this course. So the distinction here is between natural law that's descriptive and natural law that's prescriptive. What we're talking about in this course is a law that commands what we should do, not that describes what we actually do. And to see the difference, you could think of any explanation people might give of why sometimes human beings violate the law. What we mean there is they violate like the laws of their country. They commit crimes. You can have an explanation of that. You can have an explanation of it that might even refer to natural law. Like you might think there are some biological facts about people that make them break the law. Then you'd be using a descriptive sense of the natural law. Like if you said, human beings have an evolved tendency to be violent when they're scared, something like that. And they commit crimes when they get violent. You would have a descriptive law that would explain why someone's violating a prescriptive law, a law that says, don't hurt other people. We use the same word for it, but that's just a quirk of our language, right? It's just a quirk of English that we have one and the same word, law, that is used as the name of descriptive principles and prescriptive principles. But we're interested in the prescriptive, laws that tell you what you should do, not that describe what you actually do. Now, I don't want to suggest that there's some huge difference between these two, because part of the whole idea of natural law theory is that the natural law is based in human nature, or in other words, based in a proper description of what we're like. So there's going to be interrelationships here, but just to be clear, we're talking here not about principles that describe how people behave, but principles that say how they should behave. Now, what's the point of this? Right? Why is this important for a discussion of justice? Well, it's important for a discussion of justice because it relates to the concept or the idea of legitimate authority. Basically, it relates to the question, should you obey the law, right? The actual law. And we'll get into a distinction between kinds of law. St. Thomas Aquinas is going to have a distinction of law into three types: eternal law, natural law, and human law. Human law is the one we're most familiar with. It's the law passed by like your local government, things like that. You can ask questions like, when should you obey the law? Many of you will have read at some point something like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, where he argues that some laws ought to be broken. And when you're asking, should you obey the law, what you're effectively asking is whether the state that passed that law is a legitimate authority. Whether the fact that the state passed the law gives you reason to obey the law, and even next door, it gives you overriding reason to obey the law. And the idea here is that some states are legitimate in this sense, so that if something is against the law, you just shouldn't do it, and that some states aren't. Most people agree that, for example, Nazi Germany was not a legitimate state, or the state in Nazi Germany, the Third Reich, was not a legitimate state. And so that no one did anything morally wrong in violating their laws. Just the fact that the Third Reich said to do something did not give you a reason to do it. And when I say reason here, I mean a reason other than self-interest. You, of course, had a self-interested reason to obey the law in the Third Reich. If you didn't obey the law, they would kill you, or punish you harshly in some way. You can always have that kind of reason to obey the law. Sometimes that's gone, like when a state fails. Like, for example, when Afghanistan failed as a state after the U.S. Army pulled out, when the recognized government in Afghanistan failed, part of what happened there is they lost the ability to enforce their own laws. And so sometimes that can be gone, but usually a state can make people have reasons of self-interest to follow the law because the state can punish you if you don't. But when a state is a legitimate authority, you have reasons beyond just pure self-interest, beyond just not wanting to get punished, to obey the law. And so when we're talking about legitimate authority, we're talking about whatever has to be true for it to be the case that you have a reason other than self-interest to obey the law. And this will be important when, as is often the case, you're in a situation where you know you can't be caught for breaking the law. You know you won't be punished because you know no one's going to find out. You're very often in that situation if you stop and think about it. And so if we're going to have widespread obedience to the law, which does seem like it's important, right, for a well-functioning society, then it does seem like we need a legitimate authority. And St. Thomas Aquinas' analysis of the law and the different kinds of law is supposed to provide a guide for deciding when you ought to obey the law, what kinds of laws you ought to obey, things like that. I want to make another distinction here, and it's similar to the descriptive versus prescriptive distinction when it comes to the nature of natural law, and it has to do with authority. Sometimes people will use the word authority in a way that just means power. Right? Sometimes people will say authority just means power, so that you are in authority if you have the power to make people do things. That is not, well, one, I think that's just a confusion, right? That's running two different concepts together. But that's certainly not what we're talking about here. Authority and power are not the same thing. The idea is someone could have power over you, but have no authority over you. When the mugger, pulls out a gun and says, "Give me your wallet," they have power over you, but they don't have authority over you. Right? If they had authority over you, it would be appropriate for them to use their power. That's another way to think about legitimate authority. A state has legitimate authority when it is appropriate for the state to use its power to make you do things. But sometimes that's not the case. And you can also ask these questions outside the context of the state. For example, you can ask whether it's legitimate for your boss to exert certain kinds of power over you. We have certain laws that say bosses can't make you do certain things. They can't make you reveal your health status, for example. They can't make you work for no money, right? They can't make you do all sorts of things. Their legitimate authority is bounded. There's certain things that no employer ever has legitimate authority to do to you. They might still have the power to do it, right? You might be so desperate for money that when the boss says, I need you to come in Saturday, but don't clock in, you do it because you're afraid of losing your job, right? So you're going to work without pay so that you don't lose the days where you do get paid. But that's just power. That's not legitimate authority. So what we're talking about when we talk about the law is legitimate authority, which is important for figuring out when you ought to obey the law, which is, of course, very important when it comes to figuring out what justice is, what justice demands, how we should treat other people, how we shouldn't treat other people. So that's what Aquinas's theory of natural law is being used, at least in this course, to do. And I think we'll now get into what the different kinds of law are, what their relationships are, and why there's more than one kind. Okay, so let's talk about the three different kinds of law: eternal or divine law, natural law, and human law. So eternal or divine law, I put divine in there because it's another thing Aquinas calls it, and it's what many other people also call it. That makes it pretty clear that this is coming from God. God, right, is the source of eternal law. And eternal law is the highest law. Right? So, keep in mind, St. Thomas Aquinas is a Dominican friar. He's a man of the church, lived his whole life, or almost his whole life in the church. And this is exactly the kind of, thing you'd expect to hear. But keep in mind also some of those political debates that were going on in the centuries leading up to Aquinas's life and period when he was writing. There was that big dispute over what the ultimate authority in society was going to be. Was it going to be the Pope, or was it going to be the Emperor, or the Pope, or the kings? And what Aquinas is going to say is that all law, including natural law and human law, has its source in divine law. So all authority has its source in God. Now that won't by itself settle the issue of who is the ultimate source of authority, say, for example, in the Holy Roman Empire. But it does set the landscape up, in a sense, where the Pope's got a leg up, right? Because the Pope is supposed to be the primary guide for the church. God, the church itself is the guide for human beings to understand, God, and the Pope is the leader of the church, whereas the emperor doesn't actually have a position in the church. The emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, that is. If you're at all familiar with the Byzantine Empire, which is the Eastern Roman Empire that survived on for another 1,000 years, there the emperor did have kind of a position within the church, but that's not what we're talking about with Aquinas. And then later on, there will be other churches, like, for example, the Church of England, where the King of England or the Queen of England is the head of the church, right? But in the medieval period, kings and queens and emperors, they were not members of the church. And so when Aquinas says, as he does, that eternal law is the source of natural law, and that natural law is the source of human law, or to put it another way, human law is derived from natural law, and natural law is derived from eternal law. What he's saying is all legal authority comes ultimately from God. Now, you might then wonder, why do we need natural law or human law? Why can't we just have eternal or divine law? Well, for one thing, the eternal or divine law is broader than the natural law. It covers things that the natural law does not. For another, the eternal or divine law is not something we can ever actually fully understand, according to Aquinas. Aquinas had a general theological position that God was completely, or the nature of God was completely beyond the comprehension of human beings. And as a result, so is the divine law. We can't understand the divine law fully. So the natural law, a way to think about the natural law, is it's the part of the eternal or divine law that applies to us. So it's not the law that covers, other animals. It's not the law that covers angels, things like that. It's the part of the eternal or divine law that applies to us. And it's the part of the eternal or divine law that we can know through reason. And this is going to be very important later on when other people pick up the idea of natural law from Aquinas, especially when non-Catholics or even non-Christians are picking it up. They're going to be attached to this idea that the natural law is knowable by reason. So part of the difference between the natural law and the eternal or divine law is that we can know what the natural law is. Aquinas says it is imprinted in us. We, in a sense, it's innate. We had it in our soul from birth. The reason for that is that the natural or divine law, or the natural law rather, because it's about us, because we can know ourselves, we can know what the law is. Because the point of the divine law, given that God is good and beneficent, the divine law is directed towards the good of everything, right? The divine law has a goal, right? Its goal is the good of everything. The natural law has a goal then as well. And the goal of the natural law is the good of human beings. It's the good of human beings individually and collectively. Now, there is an article in the reading, and in case you're unfamiliar with Aquinas, the way that the reading is organized is he asks a series of questions, or rather, there's a series of questions, and each question has multiple articles, multiple issues that fall under that question. So like there'll be one question like, what is the nature of natural law? And there'll be several articles under that, each one that asks questions about a particular aspect of the natural law. And so there is one of these articles where Aquinas investigates or considers whether the natural law is guided towards the good of individuals or the good of the community. And he says it's guided towards the good of the community. But that's not because it doesn't care about individual good. It's because Aquinas thinks it's only possible for you to achieve your own individual good in the context of a community. There's no such thing as an individual good that conflicts with the good of the community. And that's going to be an important thing to keep in mind, especially when we get to some later authors who, it's going to be very clear, don't quite agree. So the natural law has the good of human beings as its goal. But what's good for us depends on our nature, on human nature. It depends on what we're like. In the same way that it does for, say, animals, right? It's like suppose you own a horse and you have to decide where to put the horse. And you get to choose between putting the horse in a very large field where the horse has the opportunity to run around, or you have an opportunity to put the horse in a barn for the rest of its life and it'll never leave that little barn. Which one should you do? Well, it seems like the right answer is don't put the horse in the barn for its whole life. Let it run around. Why? Well, because that's what horses are supposed to do. Horses are built to run. It would go against the horse's nature to have it locked up in a pen inside a barn its whole life. Now, that doesn't mean it's always wrong to put a horse inside a pen in a barn. That'd be crazy. You need to put it in there to keep the horse warm, for example, if you live in a cold climate, things like that. But it would obviously be wrong to keep a horse basically locked in place its whole life. And you know that from the horse's nature. All you have to do is understand what the horse is like, and you know it's supposed to run around. In a way that, for example, if you had to choose between putting a turtle out in a field or putting a turtle in a pen, you might actually choose a pen for the turtle, or an aquarium or terrarium or whatever it is you put turtles in. Turtles are not supposed to run around. They don't need as much space, right? But if you're choosing between putting a turtle in a very dry place or a place with water, you're going to go with the water, right? So from the nature of a living being, you can figure out what's good for that being. So the good of human beings, because we're living beings, is determined by our nature. And because of that, by investigating our own nature, we can figure out what is good for us, which is why anyone can figure out what the natural law is. And this is going to be a very, very, very important thing for especially later generations. And it's that any rational being should be able to figure out what the natural law is, even if they don't believe in God. A large part of the natural law, Aquinas takes from an earlier Greek philosopher named Aristotle, who was not Christian, and whose beliefs about God, Aristotle believed in God kind of, but it was a very weird God. Aristotle thought God didn't care about human beings. So definitely Aristotle does not believe, or did not believe, that God handed down a law that was designed for the good of all beings. Aristotle thought God only thought about God, because it would be beneath God's perfection to think about anything else. So Aristotle nonetheless came up with a lot of the ethical claims, a lot of the ethical theory that Aquinas himself accepted. A way to think about Aquinas's intellectual career is Aquinas took Aristotle and tried to incorporate Aristotle into a Christian worldview. Now, what that meant is there's this whole thing, eternal or divine law, in Aquinas' system that just does not exist in Aristotle's. But another way to look at that is that Aquinas would have been aware of someone who did not believe in anything like the Christian God, Aristotle, who nonetheless was able to figure out the natural law, because Aquinas doesn't really change much about what he thinks the natural law is about from Aristotle. So you only really need to know about human nature to figure out what the natural law is. That said, Aquinas does believe natural law only gets its authority from God. And that is a genuine difference between him and Aristotle. And it's going to be a genuine difference between him and some of the other theorists we're going to look at. But natural law is the part of the divine law that applies to human beings. You can know it through reason, because it's based fundamentally on our human nature, which he thinks we can investigate rationally in a way that we can't investigate God rationally. Or at least we can never hope to understand God fully through rational investigation, according to Aquinas. Now, the last kind of law is human law. Human law is derived from natural law the same way natural law is derived from divine law, or at least it is derived from it. There is a slight difference in how it's derived. So the natural law is, in a sense, just a part of the divine law. It's like you took a section of it and considered it on its own. Which section of the divine law? The section of the divine or eternal law that applies to human beings. Human law is a little bit different. Human law starts from natural law, which is very general and applies to everybody. There's an article in the reading where Aquinas says the natural law is the exact same for all human beings across time and space. It never changes and it applies to everybody. But if the natural law is the same in all places and the natural law is the same at all times, you kind of know from that that the natural law has to be very general and not very specific. Because, of course, what the right thing to do is, in any particular case, depends on the facts of the situation. And so you can have two people, for one of whom it's right to do something, and for another person it's wrong to do that same thing, because they're in different situations. For example, it is wrong for me to kill my neighbor. Right? I say that because I just heard my neighbor make a lot of noise. Of course, it's wrong independent of the noise he makes. It's wrong for me to kill my neighbor. But there have been some people for whom it's right to kill their neighbor. Who's that? Well, people whose neighbors are about to kill them. You can kill in self-defense. The facts of the situation changes things. My neighbor is not trying to hurt me. My neighbor's not doing anything bad to me. So I have no right to kill him in self-defense because I'm not in a situation where self-defense is called for. So for one of us, it's right to do it. And for others, it's wrong to do it. But that's not because the natural law is different. The natural law is the same. The natural law that covers this kind of case basically says don't kill other people except in self-defense. I'll have more to say about that actually kind of case in another video on Aquinas. But that's a very general law. Right? And so what you should do in any particular case is going to depend on the circumstances. And figuring out how what you should do depends on the circumstances is the function of human law. Human law is different from place to place. Right? Different circumstances in different parts of the world require different laws. To use another example, it would definitely be wrong for us to kill elderly people once they could no longer work and contribute to the community. I think almost everybody would agree to that. But there have been times and places in human history where if elderly people who could not contribute to the group anymore were still supported, it might cause the whole group to die because they don't have enough resources to support them. That would be a way in which your circumstances, so for example, it's often said that Inuit tribes would basically euthanize their elderly in part to prevent them from suffering, prevent them from starving to death because the tribe just couldn't take care of them anymore. Because if they did, they would run out of food for everybody. I don't actually know if that's true. It's just a story that's commonly told. But if it were true, you could make sense of it, right? If you're living in the Arctic and you depend on catching fish or seals or things like that just to feed everybody, you might not make it through a long winter or something like that if you had to support a large population of people who weren't contributing to the group. Different situations call for different laws. But also over time, there is a call for different laws. One thing that Aquinas says is human law is progressive the same way that the natural sciences are progressive, right? Over time, science gets better and better. It gets more accurate, right? The more people who are approaching trying to solve a problem, the more people using their reason to solve a problem, the better the results will get with time. And Aquinas thinks the same thing is true of human law. Right? Over time, human law gets better. Now, that said, he doesn't think that human law should change very much. And the reason for that is one of the primary purposes of having human law. And human law here is like the law passed by your government, right? The laws that the legislature passes or that the king passes or something like that. The law, part of the purpose of having human law is to create habits of obeying the law in people, right? Just that because we have natural law in us, as Aquinas says we do, doesn't mean we follow it, right? This is one of the unique things about human beings, according to Aquinas. We're able to defy the law that governs us. Right? So this, for Aquinas goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden and things like that, right? Because we're able to defy the natural law, because we're able to know what's right but still do voluntarily what's wrong, that means that we need guidance. Right? We need guidance in shaping our habits. This is another thing he gets from Aristotle, that the way to make good people is to habituate them into doing the right thing. And part of the function of human law is to create those habits. And because habits have to be reinforced over and over and over again, you don't want to change the law all the time because that would undermine its ability to help foster good habits. So human law varies based on circumstances. Human law is getting better over time, Aquinas thinks. Human law is suited to the place where the law is passed. This is going to be part of the reason for Aquinas why there are different kingdoms, or as we might say now, different countries, right? What is a good idea in Norway might not be a good idea in Italy. So you have the three kinds of law, but the authority of human law comes from the authority of natural law, which comes from the authority of eternal or divine law. So what happens if a state passes a law that conflicts with natural law? Well, what Aquinas says is that's not actually a law. You might think, well, that's weird. I mean, it's a law that got passed. How could it not be a law? What he says is such a law is actually an act of violence. So the thing to be aware of here is that anytime a government passes a law, it's effectively announcing a threat. When a government passes a law, it's saying, do this, right? Mow your lawn, mow your front lawn, keep it trimmed or whatever. But what it's really saying is do this or else. Do this or we will punish you. The government doesn't say pay your taxes. The government says pay your taxes or we'll put you in jail. In other words, every law is a threat of violence. Now you might think, well, violence is always wrong. You can't do violence. Well, Aquinas doesn't think that. Violence isn't always wrong. You need threats of violence to get people to do the right thing, to obey the law, the natural law. And so sometimes threats of violence are appropriate. When are threats of violence from the government appropriate? Only when they are compelling obedience to human laws that are derived from the natural law. Or in other words, only when the law is guided towards the good of human beings. When a king or a state passes a law that is not good for the community, that is just violence. It has no authority. You have no duty to obey it. So laws passed that are intended to benefit individuals rather than the whole community, right? Laws that hurt the community as a whole, laws that do not further the common good, are mere acts of violence. They do not deserve obedience. This was a low-key revolutionary thing for Aquinas to say in the 1200s. Right? What he was effectively saying is every king who passes laws that are not good for the whole community is basically just a warlord, and you don't have any duty to obey him. Obey him out of self-interest, to keep yourself from getting killed, fine. But it has no legitimate authority if it's not derived ultimately from the law of God. And the way you know something is derived from the law of God is just if it's good for the community as a whole. That's it. Right? We don't know what the divine law is apart from that. The only part of the divine law that we know for sure is the natural law. And the natural law is just about what's good for us. Right? Us as individuals necessarily living in communities, right, whose good is determined by the community we're in. So human law, strictly speaking, is only that part of the sort of legal code that you live under that's actually derived from the natural law. You have no duty to obey any part of the legal code that's not in accordance with the natural law. And you might now, I mentioned earlier in the video, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, you might be seeing where some of those ideas in Martin Luther King's essay come from, right? He's basically just working from Aquinas. Now, Martin Luther King wasn't Catholic, but all Protestants, Protestantism comes out of Catholicism, and the intellectual heritage of Catholicism is still very present, very strong in Baptist churches, which is what Martin Luther King was. So human law is not all the laws passed by the government, because a lot of those things aren't laws, they're just acts of violence. Okay, so this has been a video on the nature of the law and the source of legitimate authority, according to Aquinas. There's going to be a couple more videos. I'm going to talk about what the content of that law is. So this has been very, very general, very, very schematic. But also going to talk about some particular applications of the law, especially as regards the use of violence. This is going to be a big part of this course. And we're going to look at Catholic just war theory, and we're going to look at what Aquinas has to say about when it's appropriate to use violence and when not. So we're going to have a video on just war theory. We're also going to have a video on something called the doctrine of double effect, which is a part of just war theory, although it has broader applications. And we're also going to just look in general at the relationship between law and morality, which kind of touched on a little bit here, but I'll have a separate video for because this video is already getting a little long.